Our next panelist is David Montgomery. He is Farnham Professor of History Emeritus at Yale University and past president of the Organization of American Historians. He worked for 10 years as a machinist in New York and the Twin Cities and was an active member of IAM, UE, and the Teamsters during those years. He is the author of many books, including The Fall of the House of Labor, The Workplace, the State, and American Labor Activism, 1865 to 1825. Citizen Worker, The Experience of Workers in the U.S. with Democracy and the Free Market During the 19th Century. Workers' Control in America, Studies in the History of Work, Technology, and Labor Struggles, and Beyond Equality, Labor and the Radical Republicans, 1862 to 1872. His latest book is Black Workers' Struggle for Equality in Birmingham, written in conjunction with Professor Horace Huntley of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. David?
Thank you very much, Margaret. Thank you, Alice, for covering so much of what I wanted to say up here. So this spares all of you, I think, a little bit of Montgomeryism in this particular session. But I do want to repeat a basic point. There's no question but that the Obama election opened up enormous hopes among the people of this country. Hopes for exactly what is often hard to say. And that's what we've got to have a hand in defining over the course of the years to come. But hopes, yes, hopes evident in the appearance of the first sit-down strike in a long time. No sooner is he elected than wham, workers in Chicago occupy the factory and the police do not throw them out. Obama says they were right, and they win the demands that were there. The only thing wrong with that whole struggle was the press report, which said there have been no sit-down strikes in America since the 1930s. I was in one in Brooklyn, New York in 1953, American safety races. Same union, though, so that's maybe what pulls them all together in this struggle. But the fact of the matter is, that these hopes have opened up. The victory of the workers of Smithfield Ham in winning after 15 years of struggle, first of all fought by the Latino workers, devastated by immigration service raids. Then the hopes were taken over by African-American workers until the NLRB actually issued a few good rulings, reinstating a couple of the Latinos, and suddenly there was a united front of the two groups that made for this new hope in a new atmosphere that was there. This sense, then, that something can be done by popular action, even in my new neighboring city of Philadelphia, something that seems far removed from the wars, a decree of the government to close 11 library branches. And suddenly there's been a massive turnout of the population. Everybody from local African-American inhabitants to anarchists to anyone in between, all joining forces to say, our children deserve some libraries. This kind of mobilization from below is something I think we're going to see an enormous amount more of in the years to come. It doesn't by itself define what the government is doing, because when we think of the basic characteristics of this Bush-Cheney administration that Alice Kessler Harris has outlined for you so neatly, the promise of 1,000 years of war, to use a phrase that Bush used one time, war to save civilization, namely us, versus terror. The promise, then, of free markets, and indeed not only the notion that if markets are somehow left untouched, all will always work for the best, leaving always aside just how free are these markets she's talking about. Are they at all like, let's say, the markets of an Arab bazaar, where people sit down individually and hassle over prices? When was the last time you did that? with something that you were buying in a marketplace. Oh, clearly this is free corporate enterprise, is what has been covered by this slogan of the beauty, the infallibility of market decisions. A third element, which I think deserves mention in this, however, is the new power of the administrative state. Powers taken on by agencies above and beyond the law. No place, I think, is this clear, though it's clear in the whole bumbling Homeland Security Administration. But clearest most of all in the Department of Labor, which for the first time in its history has been run by somebody explicitly and openly hostile to labor unions, Secretary Chow, and who has used her office to virtually shut down Safety and Health Administration, to shut down even the seemingly impregnable mine inspection, because mining companies generally liked government mine inspections. But the government now has cut that out, and we're beginning to see the disasters reappearing around the land. Putting 1,000 new people to work in the Department of Labor, checking the books of every local union in the United States, while removing all the regulations that were on employers in the United States. This kind of new power being issued by administrative decree, I think, is an essential part of this link of the promise of war and of the free market, so-called. On the war promise, and on all the three of those, however, those of us here, especially historians, this is supposed to be our profession, always have to ask ourselves just what's new. After all, there are long precedents for much of what the Bush and Cheney administration have been doing, and sorting out what was building up since World War II with what new level of horror has come with the Bush-Cheney administration, I think is an extremely important part for us to play. Take, for example, the glorification of free markets. The whole administration over the world of the International Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, has all been devoted to the forcing the privatization of industry and the turning over of all resources to foreign investments, creating local economies into export economies, export of goods, and perhaps unintentionally, export of people on a massive scale around the world. This is all there, after all. NAFTA stands out very much in our minds, but we think of how the whole economy of Mexico was privatized in preparation for Mexico, for NAFTA. NAFTA simply signed on the dotted line of what was done. And this is now evident in the great strike in Cananea mines. Mexican historians among you, the very name Cananea should have you up. This is where the revolutionary struggle began in 1906. And now the workers have been out on strike for 2 years against a new private owner that has been introduced into those pits. Here then is the question that we must face, first of all, on the war program. The phrase that Rumsfeld came up with, shock and awe, I think stands out as the crucial thing. That we see ourselves holding, Rumsfeld, after all, never wanted to increase the infantry very much. But he always wanted to have power to bomb, and bomb anything into oblivion. A doctrine that is being repeated right before our eyes, of course, in the Gaza Strip today. But here was the notion then that we could single-handedly bend anyone to the will of the United States. And in the marketplace, we've seen emerge, I think, not only this absolute glorification of private ownership. Again, not entirely new. It was Margaret Thatcher who first came up with the idea that if you put in private ownership of homes, you will destroy socialism in the Labour Party in England. So here, again, this idea is taken over to the United States, but turned into a form of mobilizing absolutely speculative runaway capitalism, running away with such disastrous results that even Albert Greenspan has confessed his errors. The notion that you see people from big banking corporations nowadays say, we went too far, means that the question is, how far back do you go and what comes in their place? These are the new innovations, a new level of scale, and indeed a qualitatively new ideal. The U.S. alone could control and dominate the globe with its power to destroy. The question then is, that we have taken up here in Historians Against the War, is first of all how to end the war in Iraq and the many wars that have come around it. And certainly our campaigning had a great deal to do with the large-scale mobilization that made Obama place ending the war in Iraq at the center of the few things that he talked about explicitly in his campaign programs. But it also has meant that these great hopes that emerged out of the fall of 2008, along with the economic crisis and ever-growing numbers of unemployed, have left us the task then of not only building on these hopes among the American people to try and redefine the promise and perils of the world in which we find ourselves, but also mobilize to see to it that Obama keeps these promises and indeed to help define them more explicitly. The question of health care that Alice Kessler Harris talked about is right up at the top of the agenda. But right behind it, the question of, we have a new Secretary of Labor, friendly to immigrants, of all things. Friendly to immigrants throughout the country, and indeed friendly to reconstructing the kind of Labor Department policies that Madam Perkins once stood for. But even the New York Times asked the question, how much support will she get from Obama? Because he surrounded himself with people from the major banks who say the worst thing we can do in a crisis is to disturb workplace relations. All right? Clearly, our role as a public is going to be crucial in helping to define the answers to these questions. What do we mean by bailed out? Who gets bailed out and under what terms? Do we do it by reducing everybody's living standard, as was done in the General Motors bailout? Or do we do it by building up purchasing power so that we can pull ourselves out of this long-term crisis? This means that a major task before all of us now is not only to keep open, but to broaden the discussion of not only what kind of a world we want to get rid of, the one that Bush and Cheney have given us, but what kind of a world we want to create. And as we think about this, as many ideas on that as there are people here. All right, let's get together and exchange them and see what kind of joint activities we come up with. I think of the cartoon in the New Times, the paper of the Chicago Federation of Labor in 1919, with a door that says, Versailles Conference. And outside of it are a bunch of workers banging on the door. They say, you couldn't make war without us, you can't make peace without us. That should be our slogan.